As I write this, there are those in the current U.S. administration that are questioning the use of alternative energy. Not questioning, they're actively defunding these programs. And they're using arguments such as, how do you get solar power at night? Or wind power when there is no wind? These are stupid arguments that have more to do with the oil and gas money in politics than actual hard science. China is leading the world right now in solar power generation, and Australia just announced that parts of the country are entirely self-sufficient, meaning residents pay nothing for their electricity. So flip that around. What if we had an abundance of alternative energy feeding the power grid? Would that be great? Well, what if the grid simply can't handle that? Shortly after noon on April 28, 2025, a major blackout rippled across the Iberian Peninsula, affecting mainland Portugal and parts of Spain. There, in the middle of the day, the electrical power grid was interrupted for about 10 hours. Longer in some areas. Here's Deutsche World with more.
Bustling Barcelona plunged into darkness, residents stranded due to trains also having no electricity, and tourists spending the night in airports and stations. It was just one day, with life back to normal soon enough. But the obvious question was, how could this happen? Some blamed a sudden solar energy failure at a time when the sun was shining brightly.
The solar power plants responded as planned, in line with the grid codes.
The problem appeared to settle around the idea that there was an abundance of alternative energy feeding into the grid. With coal and nuclear, more traditional polluting methods, that energy can be anticipated and controlled. In this case, it was a sunny afternoon, and there was an abundance of solar and wind power, and no way to regulate it in the moment. Again, here's Deutsche World.
So at what point did the failure occur between generation and use? On June 17th, a good 6 weeks after the blanket power outage, the minister responsible presented the preliminary findings of an investigation. There were several factors leading to the total blackout. We have indications that there was too little capacity to control the voltage. There were various reasons. On the one hand, poor planning, but also because operators did not follow standard procedure.
It's clear by now that what happened in Spain and Portugal wasn't an attack. It was, however, a demonstration of what could happen when various new technologies expand rapidly, where the new clashes with old existing methods of, say, power generation. I think it's great that we have wind and solar power. I only wish the U.S. was producing more of it, so that we would have to start to figure out how to handle it. This is a story about how we need to make new technologies work with the old, and how we need to make IoT work better together overall. I'm Robert Famosi. This is Error Code.
I am Dan Berte, and I am an IoT Director for BitDefender. BitDefender is a global cybersecurity leader that's very well known for its consumer products, but its recent years has been applauded with accolades for the new IoT strides and the enterprise foray as well.
I've spoken with Dan before. Most recently was last year at Black Hat USA 2024, where he presented on solar panel inverters being vulnerable to attack. That talk proved to be prescient. Not that the outage in Spain and Portugal was caused by an attack on the inverters in the system. No. Evidence today does not support that. Rather, the blackout in Spain and Portugal serves to illustrate what can happen when these inverters fail, or when they're not even present in the system to begin with.
Wow, it's been a year. It's been a year since we last spoke, Robert. But kind of walking back to the story of last year for those who might need a reminder. Our researcher team looked at a photovoltaic system that was found to have vulnerabilities that could compromise it. Now, that in itself is not, anything unusual that happens. Researchers find things all the time, but the issue and that particular research was that the vendors impacted represented a large portion of the photovoltaic production globally, and the implications could have been massive. Another new angle to that research was that it was our first time when, in a history of looking at typically consumer devices, we found that something that would qualify as infrastructure device, because that's what a photovoltaic is, even if it's on your personal home, now for the researchers looked like a typical baby monitor. So it was this interesting hybrid situation where a very mission critical system that we kind of now take it for granted with the adoption of photovoltaics, which is amazing, by the way. We're seeing a situation where they're more dangerous if mishandled and misused, namely attacked, of course. And that's not surprising, but it's the first time that we could see something that was that had a high impact.
In episode 43 of Error Code, I talked with Dan about his research that he presented last year at Black Hat that identified 3 vulnerabilities in a very common solar panel system that potentially could allow an adversary to get credentials, even credit card information about customers. It could also be used to overwhelm the grid itself. That's because the vulnerabilities were in the inverter, the device that regulates how much energy is shared with the local power grid. It sits between the solar panel and the grid. That's not what happened in Spain. And I want to be clear, there's no evidence that there was an attacker involved in Spain or Portugal. I only want to circle back on that previous episode because the inverter seems to have some relevance here. Here's what Dan said a year ago about the vulnerabilities that he found.
And then you could potentially alter the grid, overload the grid, or take down the grid. And to give you the sense of the scale of this, we're talking about the installed capacity of about 3 medium countries, or total installed capacity for this system, these providers that are involved, that would surpass the U.S. solar generation capacity. So it's a really big system that was impacted. So without potentially getting into the names right now, it's top 5. It's a top 5 manufacturer globally, and the vulnerabilities would potentially allow attackers to exfiltrate enormous amounts of user data, location, whatever, or even shift the grid.
So, of course, the common question is going to be, is the grid safe?
Out of previous podcasts, that there's been a lot of debate. Is the grid safe or not? How is it, potentially being impacted and stuff? And the grid is not something we focused previously that much, because I said, we're focusing on your baby monitors mostly, maybe, or TVs or whatever. But some of our teams already previously did research, for example, on EV charging stations as well, and we found vulnerabilities there as well. So I would say that based on the findings here, the grid now is no longer the old grid. So that would be whatever, coal power plant or gas power plant or distribution network and stuff. When we're talking about solar, they're much closer to what we are when we're talking about connected cars, vehicle to vehicle, stuff like that. It's all connected. It's all online. All these things have apps. They have clouds. They talk to the web. They talk to the endpoints. And basically, I think it's up to the creativity of the potential attacker.
Dan's right. The power grid today not only includes your battery electric vehicle, because the vehicle can act as a storage unit for electrical power, we also have to think about it more broadly.
Because you have, I don't know if you have a solar system, but you have ways to limit the output based on the demand of the grid. So basically, if the grid is overloaded, you can set a limit and you're not going to pump more power into the grid. But let's say an attacker would bypass that and overload the grid, or all of a sudden remove power generation to I don't know. So which kind of anecdotally reminds me of some of my friends here in Silicon Valley who had a Tesla and a regular ICE car, and they were debating getting another EV, and they were like, well, what if the grid suffers? And what happens if, California gets into a situation where we can't drive either of our cars? And I never thought of it that way, but they brought it home where it's a potential nuisance, at least, to potentially worse kind of a situation.
In security, it's always scary when we move from the theoretical to the applied in the real world. When someone demonstrates on a large scale, in public, what we thought might happen.
Yourself, have asked, okay, so what can happen? What's the ultimate avenue for attack, or what's the worst that can happen? And of course, other people have asked us the same thing. And now I think we have a great academic example. We're not happy that has happened, but earlier this year, Spain has had a massive blackout. Going back to that event, which was sparked. Now we know, after months of research, we know now there was an imbalance in the way the grid was handled, caused primarily by renewable sources. Where in fact in the past we would have your old school generation, be it nuclear or gas or hydro, coal, whatever. Those capabilities have the capability to absorb variations in demand in the grid. However, in this particular case, some sort of mismanagement with a bit of bad luck allowed these renewables to topple the grid by just producing too much power at one time without having the demand met. And in terms of the power grid, whatever matters is having a perfect match between the consuming side and the generation side. So you always have to produce exactly as much as consumption is needed, else there's an imbalance, the grid may fail. So going back to the research of last year, that's exactly what one grave avenue, an attacker could exploit these vulnerable photovoltaic solar systems by, instructing them, for example, to produce more electricity than the grid demands, and thus creating this imbalance that ultimately can topple the grid. And we've seen dramatic, days where it took. And by the way, when you destabilize the grid, you can't just turn on a power plant and it's all back to normal. It takes a long time of rebooting, putting things back on track, reassessing demand, and of course, when you flip the switch to turn power back on, everybody's gonna drop power all at once, and you don't know exactly what's on, what's off. All these things have to mitigate. It's a lengthy process, and it takes multiple steps. And there's been millions of people that were not very happy, obviously. And who knows, economic output damages, people who needed help that can be helped. All these things that are dramatic have happened and may happen in case these things happen. So we've seen, fortunately, researchers are looking at these systems. We've seen more attention given to these systems in as a way to obviously improve the outlook of using renewables, because of course there's always this battle between pro and anti renewables. I think there's always two sides that fight and that might want to use the PR angles. However, one more thing I'd like to add to this really interesting story is, because people would ask, okay, so no system is completely secure. What do we do? So of course, those systems were eventually repaired, were patched, everything was fine. Of course, the expectation is that they'll keep looking. Our researchers will keep looking to make sure that these systems are as safe as can be. But at the same time, there's other mitigations which are unexpected. For example, different countries are starting to ask to have regulation that demands that certain power solar farms stay offline in terms of internet connectivity at a certain threshold, so they have a less of a chance to be weaponized. Does that make sense? So instead of just making sure it's basically air gapping solar, finally, I guess. So that's one way to mitigate things. So I think our findings, our research, corroborated with the example of the worst case scenario, which was Spain, corroborated with the new regulation and improvements, I think put us in a much better place than we were a year ago, which is salutary and fantastic for an upcoming technology that is basically at the forefront of power generation.
Dan's hit upon a great theme, and one that I love to straddle, and that is the unintended consequences of our new technologies. Vulnerabilities aside, there is a disconnect old assumptions clashing with new technologies. I have seen that the weakness in these new IoT systems are often in the handoffs, going from an internal network to external and back again. Here, it's solar power feeding the grid, and the grid expecting measured units, not in abundance at various times. It's a scenario that hasn't really been tested or planned for, and in the case of Spain and Portugal, the grid came up short. It shut down. These handoffs are rife with misconfigurations and leftover open services, even generic passwords. And that's because the assumption has been that it was a physical contact with the device and not cyber connectivity. One of the buzz phrases that's been top of mind here at Black Hat USA is living off the land attacks. I always think of that with the software angle. And as I walk around Black Hat, I do see solutions for living off the land attacks that are focused on software and services. But what about hardware?
As we hope our listeners would learn as well very quickly, we at BitDefender has put out a report this year. We will touch base on a couple of numbers from there as well. And it's not surprising, I believe, for anybody who is in the space looking at this particular topic, but we saw that 84% of attacks leveraged living off the land resources in companies when they pursue those attacks, which is a frightening number. So let's define living off the land attacks first, just to know what we're talking about. Every system, you mentioned software, of course. We're talking, let's say, we're talking an installation of Windows has, all different kinds of services that would be made available for the user. However, a lot of the users would never have the need to use PowerShell or other services in performing their day-to-day tasks. So, which proposes a great stress on the IT infrastructure and the IT personnel to make sure the limit the risks that these capabilities pose in the wrong hands. The same in the industrial or hardware space as well, where these capabilities are always enabled and present. However, managing them, understanding the attack surface and what avenues an attacker might take is always a stress for the IT department. So, and we see this in numbers because it's some of the easiest ways to compromise and get access to a system.
Quite simply, living off the land is when an attacker can leverage existing technology, say a misconfigured service or a service that's been left on, without having to add any additional malware. Malware can be stopped at the edge. Legitimate services running, they can't. So how does living off the land work in an OT environment?
So as the name suggests, living off the land attacks obviously uses available capabilities of the system by an attacker to get access to the resources or the organization or the files they need to get access to. And that's obviously the conundrum here. You want to have all these capabilities available. However, you want to be able to prioritize these tools to those who actually need them. And a lot of organizations are having a hard time managing these resources, in fact. So, of course, we're going to hear a lot at Black Hat. We're going to have a lot further because there's also new tools, products, and capabilities that are mitigating living off the land attacks as well in the recent months, our company included. So you will see incredibly powerful tools that are basically just looking at what the company or the organization needs to have available to all its actors and basically defaulting to nobody gets access to anything and having a case-by-case exceptions where they are needed. So obviously what we're thinking about here is the attack surface is forever larger when there's more tools available for attackers to use to get access to the organization. Simple as that.
The thing is, we've known about these living off the land attacks for several years. So I'm surprised that we haven't had this conversation earlier.
I don't know why living off the land attacks come as a surprise for the industry. But hey, as anything that gets traction and it gets visibility, that ultimately gets resources to help fix. So I'm all for it. It's all great. Right. So without getting into the details of, the kind of avenues the attackers might take into the organization via software or OT, the general gist of what we're seeing and what we're hearing is more visibility, because that's what's missing, both from the IT side, but also from the management side. The management side, the management layer wants to be a little more involved in understanding of the risk they face in case of a potential attack.
And yet we're still struggling with the traditional data breaches at a time when new technologies are forcing new ways of thinking about the threat landscape overall.
Just got an email from Air France about a breach they had involving my personal information. And this is just a more commonplace occurrence where my inbox gets filled with emails with disclosures from companies that have been affected over the recent times with non-trivial issues or information. So we're going back to the rat race of, putting more and more layers to increase the cost of attack and hopefully staying ahead of the curve by, deploying as many tools as we can. And I salute the fact that there's demand for more visibility, which I hope the new tools that are coming on the market that we're seeing at Blackout and around are bringing, beside just trying to limit access, which is obviously the first layer of defense.
So they'd be like security controls. They're literally firewalling, you're blocking protocols, you're blocking everything as a way to mitigate any potential problem.
Firewalling everything is gonna work initially, but then that's not gonna limit. John from accounting comes and says, well, I need access to this tool, and IT provides it, and then they don't need it anymore, but nobody disables it. So there's an evolution where it has to be some sort of a living organism. And I think this is why we're seeing more conversation around living off the land attacks and the tools to prevent them, is that the AI is here, or more AI tools are here, and enable security vendors to create routines that are going to be smarter in handling these management tools. Because I think that's the ultimate thing. I mean, of course, you can ironclad everything and block every potential port and tool in PowerShell, but then you'll have all the exceptions that ultimately negate the rule and need to be revisited. And doing that individually for 100,000 employees is enough. So it has to be smart enough to be able to revisit, recover, rethink. So, in fact, that's why I think maybe next year is going to be more of a living off the land attack story year than this year. I think it's just the beginning. And I think there's competition starting. As we've seen in previous years, the competition was probably who had the nicest interface for their management console has gone now, and we're going to move on to the hip new thing. But again, I'm trivializing. It's serious. It's very serious, because it's what we're seeing as, besides social engineering and other phishing cyber attacks, is what compromises organizations and more in 2025. So all for the good of the industry, all these new tools and all these new or renewed interest in living off the land attacks.
I'd like to thank Dan for coming on the show and talking about living off the land attacks and how it affects IoT in particular. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts. And I'd really like to hear from you. Go to errorcodepodcast.com to get more details. And tell me what you like, and even what you don't. I've got some great episodes coming up. We'll have more on Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, and hacking utilities supply chains. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.